My parents adopted me out because I was a boy. Now they want money from me to fund my sister's education. I'm a 25-year-old man, and my story begins not just when I was 6, but from the very day I was born. I am the third and youngest child of my parent. Although we weren't wealthy, my parents earned enough to comfortably raise 3 children. We lived in a small town in a house that had been in our family for generations, which helped us save money. My grandparents ran a farm, providing much of our sustenance. My dad was a truck driver who came home every 3 to 4 days, and my mom worked as a waitress. Before I came along, they had 2 daughters. Growing up, I always felt like the unexpected child. As a kid, I was blissfully unaware of my family dynamic. However, as I matured, I began to piece together the reality of my situation. Discovering I was an unwanted child was a harsh reality to face. My parents had considered not having me, but medical advice against it due to potential health risks to my mom deterred them. My mother had always hoped for another girl, driven by practicality more than preference. She figured that another daughter would mean reusing my sister's clothes, avoiding the cost of new outfits. My sisters, being close in age, shared their wardrobe and actually enjoyed it. However, their joy turned to disappointment when I was born a boy. Their discontent was palpable. They dressed me in my sister's old clothes and even sent me to school in their hand-me-down uniform. Those days were painfully humiliating. I still carry faint memories of the teasing I endured for wearing a girl's uniform and keeping my hair long. Any protests were met with severe punishment from my mother. My childhood was marred by abuse and harsh words, most of which were incomprehensible to me at the time. As I grew older and understood their implications, my resentment towards my parents grew. My father, though slightly more sympathetic, was absent most of the time, leaving his behavior towards me inconsistent and unpredictable. Some days, my father treated all 3 of us impartially, but on others, his harshness matched, if not exceeded, that of my mother. I wasn't a perfect child. As I grew and became painfully aware of their preference for my sisters, rebellion seemed my only recourse. They consistently received the best of everything, new clothes, new toys, while I was relegated to hand-me-downs and leftovers. In frustration, I started acting out, blaming them for my misery. Punishments were frequent and severe. I remember being grounded so often that I sometimes had to fend for myself, missing meals and preparing my own breakfast. Imagine a 6-year-old having to endure such hardships. A particularly painful memory that marked a turning point in my life involved an incident where I was viciously bullied at the playground for wearing girls' clothes. When I returned home that day, I discovered my mother had bought new holiday clothes for my sisters. In a moment of raw anger, I cut their clothes into shreds with scissors. Although I regret my actions and am not proud of them, they were driven by deep-seated pain rather than spite. However, my parents viewed this as an unforgivable offense deserving of extreme punishment. Deciding I was too much to handle, they put me up for adoption. After a month of no one showing interest, their resentment towards me only deepened. They constantly reminded me of my worthlessness and that nobody wanted me. The cruelest remarks often came from my mother, who bitterly stated, "I wish I had done a gender check. I would never have brought him into the world." Her words, heavy with loathing for something I had no control over, still haunt me to this day. As the weeks dragged on with no inquiries about my adoption, my parents began openly discussing the matter with friends and family. My father had warned the new couple about their financial situation and the possibility that I might not be able to continue my schooling. My mother's response was dismissive. She barely looked up as she said, "Who cares? Just drop him off tomorrow." I was standing in the corner, clutching the curtain. Despite everything, the thought of leaving my family filled me with fear and deep sadness. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I fought hard to keep them silent. My parents were so caught up in their relief that they didn't notice my presence. It was only when my father saw me crying that he came over, rubbed my back, and said softly, "Pack your things. We're leaving for your new home tomorrow morning." At that moment, my emotions overpowered me, and I sobbed openly, though it seemed like no one heard. Later, I returned to my room, packed my few belongings, and hoped against hope that my new family would be kinder than the last. The next day, my father drove me to the next town. The entire journey, I felt nothing. Perhaps I was just numb. My new home was modest, a small house where they had converted a warehouse into a bedroom for me. I had no complaints. I was grateful they had made space for me. Back in my old home, I had slept on a cot in the corner of my sister's room, my belongings crammed into a small closet. Even though this new room was smaller, it felt more personal and comfortable. My new parents, Mary and John, were genuinely warm and welcoming, yet I struggled to trust them. Having grown up in a dysfunctional environment where love was conditional and rarely extended to me, I was skeptical of their kindness and feared it might be temporary. I tried to keep my distance, fearing they might eventually reject me too. But over the months, I slowly realized that their affection was sincere, not an act. Yes, my education was disrupted when I moved in the middle of the school year, but Mary and John promised to enroll me the next year. Seeing how hard they worked to save money for my education, I gradually began to love and trust them. My adoption, once a source of immense pain, turned out to be a blessing. After they left me with Mary and John, my biological parents never looked back. Frankly, I felt a sense of relief at my new home. Mary and John treated me with the simple respect of acknowledging my identity as a boy, free from shame or criticism. They worked tirelessly, running their food truck for 14 to 16 hours a day, parked just outside our apartment. This meant I was never really alone. I could see them from my bedroom window. Eventually, I started spending my days at the truck, helping out wherever I could. When I began school, I dedicated myself to my studies while still assisting with the truck during my free time. By the time I was just over 10 years old, I was helping John at the cash register and discovered I had a knack for math. This early exposure to the business world sparked an interest in accounting and economics, setting the stage for my future academic pursuit. After graduating from high school, I expressed a desire to run the food truck full-time. However, Mary and John insisted that I pursue higher education first. Despite their advancing age and increasing frailty, they dipped into their savings to finance my college education. They were determined to see me succeed academically before taking over the business, a gesture of their profound generosity that I hope to reciprocate someday. I enrolled in college with a major in business and accounting, driven by a desire to make Mary and John proud. As I immersed myself in my studies, they continued to encourage me, confident they could keep the truck running for a few more years. Their belief in the importance of my education over immediate financial help demonstrated their selflessness and vision for my future. Reflecting on my adoption, I recall the stark contrast in how it came to be. My biological father had found Mary and John through an acquaintance, knowing they longed for a child despite their modest means. Despite their financial struggles, they had eagerly agreed to adopt me, a decision that brought immense joy to my biological family, who were all too ready to part ways. When my father noticed my tears, he approached me gently, patted my back, and instructed me to pack my things, saying we would leave the next morning to join my new family. His words made me cry out loud, but it felt like my cries went unheard. Resigned, I retreated to my room, packed my belongings, and prayed that my new family would be kinder than the last. The next day, my father drove me to the next town. As we left the house and throughout the drive, I was engulfed by a numbness that muted my emotions. I wasn't crying anymore. Upon arrival, I saw the modest living conditions of my new family. They lived in a small house with just one room and had converted a warehouse into a space for me. They were clearly poor, but the effort they made to provide me with my own room touched me deeply. Previously, I had never had my own bed or room, always tucked away on a cot in the corner of my sister's room. Mary and John, my new parents, welcomed me with warmth and care, emotions that were foreign to me. At my previous home, I had only seen affection directed towards my sisters, never towards myself. Initially, I was skeptical of Mary and John's intentions, fearing their kindness might be fleeting. I guarded my heart against becoming too attached, afraid of facing another rejection. However, as the months passed, I began to see that their love was genuine and not merely an act. Although my schooling was disrupted due to the mid-year move, they promised to enroll me in school the following year. Their dedication to saving money for my education, despite their own financial hardships, slowly won my heart. My love for them grew as I observed their tireless work ethic. They operated their food truck for up to 16 hours a day, yet always made time. My adoption, which initially felt like a curse, turned out to be a profound blessing. I never saw my biological parents again after they left. Within a year, sales had soared and I successfully doubled my initial investment. 4 years later, I was the proud owner of 3 bustling cafes in town. During this time, I moved Mary and John into a better apartment and secured a small place for myself, having lived with them up until then. I encouraged them to retire and let go of their food truck, but they chose to keep it for their personal satisfaction. Reflecting back, when I left their house with my bag all those years ago, I could never have imagined that I would one day graduate from college and run a successful restaurant chain. Then, Last month, on what seemed like an ordinary day at work, I encountered someone from my past. While working the cash register at one of my cafes, I looked up to see a familiar face. It was my biological father, whom I hadn't seen in almost 2 decades. He looked pale and unwell, but approached me with a broad smile and embraced me. The shock of seeing him rendered me speechless, especially with the restaurant bustling around us. I quietly led him to a corner where the flood of old, traumatic memories overwhelmed me. He expressed pride in my achievements and his happiness at seeing me succeed. I stood there, stunned and speechless. He mentioned that he had been passing by and saw John, who had updated him on my success. He promised to bring my mother to meet me over the weekend. After he left, I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions. That evening, I confided in John that I did not want to meet the parents who had abandoned me simply because I was not the daughter they wanted. Both John and Mary, fully aware of the difficulties of my childhood, understood my feelings. Despite my initial resistance, Mary encouraged me to forgive them and move forward. I reluctantly agreed to meet them, but only if John and Mary were present for support. When the day came, my biological parents visited John's house. I braced myself for an apology that never came. Instead, they spoke of the favors they believed they had done for me. My mother even suggested I should be grateful to them for placing me with John and Mary, who had raised me to be successful. Their words stung, as there was no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. A week after sending the money, my mother called again, stirring a mix of emotions within me. She expressed her gratitude before swiftly adding, "Your sisters want to see you. When can you make it?" For a moment, I entertained the thought that they genuinely wanted me back in their lives. Despite everything, I never held any resentment towards my sisters. As a child, I might have acted out towards them, but I recognized that they were not to blame for the circumstance. I tentatively agreed to meet, suggesting Sunday as a possible day for me to drive home. However, my mother quickly suggested we meet somewhere neutral instead. I didn't think much of it at the time and agreed. She said she would text me the details of the place and time. After hanging up, a nagging feeling of unease settled over. Why didn't they want me to come to their home? After so many years apart, meeting at home seemed more appropriate than a public space, yet they chose a restaurant. She later sent me an email directing me to an upscale restaurant. At the time, I was too upset about not being invited home to ponder the implications. When I arrived, they were already there. My sisters rushed to embrace me, and for a brief moment, the reunion was genuinely joyful. We laughed and caught up, and I felt a surge of happiness at seeing them after so many years. However, the atmosphere shifted when the menus arrived and they began ordering the most expensive items. My father, noticing their choices, grinned and said, "Order the most expensive one. My son is a big man now." His words, meant to be lighthearted, felt like a jab laden with cruelty and manipulation. I felt trapped as I watched them indulge, knowing that they were frivolously spending my money. Despite wild thoughts of slipping away before the bill arrived, I couldn't bring myself to act on them. It felt too harsh. So I paid the bill. As I sat there, I made a silent vow to myself never to fall into their emotional traps again. Her next words were meant to reassure, "That way, you won't have to worry about anything." But I was taken aback. "Whoa! Hold on," I interrupted. "I am not making any payments." Her surprise was evident. It seemed she had never considered a refusal possible. "What do you mean you won't pay everything at once? It's fine. We can also pay in installments," she countered quickly. I firmly reiterated, "I'm not paying, period. My sister's education is not my responsibility, especially considering how you abandoned me and never looked back. Now you only reach out because you need money." At this, she lost her temper completely. "Do not forget that we gave birth to you. We arranged for a suitable guardian when we could no longer provide for you. Now it's time for you to fulfill your obligations. Your sisters and parents are your responsibility. You must take care of us all." I had much I wanted to say, but I knew my words would fall on deaf, self-centered ears. So I responded with measured calm, "Yes, I owe a lot to my parents, John and Mary. They deserve all the credit for my success. As for you, I'm not sure who you are. My documents don't bear your names, nor do I have any photos of you. I don't believe I know you at all." She hurled insults at me over the phone, but I simply replied, "Wrong number, lady," and hung up. Some may call me selfish or harsh, but I refuse to spend my hard-earned money on my so-called family. They were never there for me. They abandoned me when I was just 6 years old. And regarding the comments from my last post questioning why I referred to John and Mary by their names and not as mom and dad. I do actually call them mom and dad. It didn't happen immediately when I moved in with them, but over time, as they nurtured me with love, support, and education, my affection for them grew deep. For clarity in this narrative, I referred to them as John and Mary, but to me, they are my true parents. I don't acknowledge my biological parents because, in my heart, they simply don't exist. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around us.